All right, it's time for Chapter 4 of Riverside Literature Series, Tales of the White Hills and Sketches, written in 1889. Sketches from Memory, The Notch of the White Mountains. It was now the middle of September. We had come since sunrise from Bartlett, passing up through the valley of the Saco, which extends between mountainous walls, sometimes with a steep ascent, but often as level as a church aisle. All that day and two preceding ones we had been loitering towards the heart of the White Mountains, those old crystal hills whose mysterious brilliancy had gleamed upon our distant wanderings before we thought of visiting them. Height after height had risen, and toward one above another, till the clouds began to hang below the peaks. Down their slopes were the red pathways of the slides, those avalanches of earth, stone, and trees, which descend into the hollows, leaving vestiges of their track hardly to be effaced by the vegetation of ages. We had mountains behind us and mountains on each side, and a group of mightier ones ahead. Still, our road went up along the Saco right toward the center of that group, as if to climb above the clouds in its passage to the farther region. In old times, the settlers used to be astounded by the inroads of the northern Indians coming down upon them from the mountain rampart through some defile known only to themselves. It is, indeed, a wondrous path. A demon, it might be fancied, or one of the Titans was traveling up the valley, elbowing the heights carelessly aside as he passed, till at length a great mountain took its stand directly across his intended road. He tarries not for such an obstacle, but rendering it asunder 1,000 feet from peak to base, discloses its treasures of hidden minerals, its sunless waters, all the secrets of the mountain's innermost heart, with a mighty fracture of rugged precipice on each side. This is the Notch of the White Hills. Shame on me that I have attempted to describe it by so mean an image, feeling, as I do, that it is one of those symbolic scenes which lead the mind to the sentiment, though not to the conception, of omnipotence. We had now reached a narrow passage which showed almost the appearance of having been cut by human strength and artifice in the solid rock. There was a wall of granite on each side, high and precipitous, especially on our right, and so smooth that a few evergreens could hardly find foothold enough to grow there. This is the entrance, or in the direction we were going, the extremity of the romantic defile of the Notch. Before emerging from it, the rattling of the wheels approached behind us, and a stagecoach rumbled out of the mountain, with seats on top and trunks behind, and a smart driver in a drab green coat touching the wheel horses with the whipstock and reining in the leaders. To my mind, there was a sort of poetry in such an incident, hardly inferior to what would have accompanied the painted array of an Indian war party gliding forth from the same wild chasm. All the passengers, except a very fat lady on the back seat, had alighted. One was a mineralogist, a scientific, green-spectacled figure in black, wearing a heavy hammer with which he did great damage to the precipices, and put the fragments in his pocket. Another was a well-dressed young man who carried an opera glass set in gold and seemed to be making a quotation from some of Byron's rhapsodies on mountain scenery. There was also a trader returning from Portland to the upper part of Vermont, and a fair young girl with a very faint bloom like one of those pale and delicate flowers which sometimes occur among alpine cliffs. They disappeared, and we followed them, passing through a deep pine forest, which for some miles allowed us to see nothing but its own dismal shade. Towards nightfall, we reached a level amphitheater surrounded by a great rampart of hills which shut out the sunshine long before it left the external world. It was here that we obtained our first view, except at a distance, of the principal group of mountains. They are majestic and even awful when contemplated in a proper mood, yet by their breadth of base and the long ridges which support them, give the idea of immense bulk rather than of towering height. Mount Washington, indeed, looking near to heaven, he was white with snow a mile downward, and had caught the only cloud that was sailing through the atmosphere to veil his head. Let us forget the other names of American statesmen that have been stamped upon these hills, but still call the loftiest Washington. Mountains are earth's undecaying monuments. They must stand while she endures, and never should be consecrated to the mere great men of their own age and country, but to the mighty ones alone, whose glory is universal, and whom all time will render illustrious. The air, not often sultry in this elevated region, merely 2,000 feet above the sea, was now that word is partly missing, was now sharp and cold. It must be sharp and cold, like that of a clear November evening in the lowlands. By morning, probably there would be a frost, if not a snowfall on the grass, and rye and an icy surface over the standing water. I was glad to perceive a prospect of comfortable quarters in a house which we were approaching, and of pleasant company in the guests who were assembled at the door. Our evening party among the mountains. We stood in front of a good, substantial farmhouse of old date in that wild country. A sign over the door denoted it to be the White Mountain Post Office, an establishment which distributes letters and newspapers to perhaps a score of persons, comprising of the population of 2 or 3 townships among the hills. The broad and weighty antlers of a deer, a stag of 10, were fastened at the corner of the house. A fox's bushy tail was nailed beneath them, and a huge black paw lay on the ground, nearly severed, and still bleeding, the trophy of a bear hunt. Among several persons collected about the doorsteps, the most remarkable was a sturdy mountaineer of 6 feet 2 and corresponding bulk, with a heavy set of features such as might be molded on his own blacksmith's anvil, but yet indicative of mother wit and rough humor. As we appeared, he uplifted a tin trumpet 4 or 5 feet long and blew a tremendous blast, either in honor of our arrival or to awaken an echo from the opposite hill. Ethan Crawford's guests were of such a motley description as to form quite a picturesque group, seldom seen together except at some place like this, at once the pleasure house of fashionable tourists and the homely inn of country travelers. Among the company at the door were the mineralogist and the owner of the gold opera glasses, whom we had encountered in the Notch, 2 Georgian gentlemen who had chilled their southern blood that morning on the top of Mount Washington, a physician and his wife from Conway, a trader of Burlington, and an old squire of the Green Mountains, and 2 young married couples, all the way from Massachusetts, on the matrimonial jaunt. Besides these strangers, the rugged country of Coos, in which we were, was represented by half a dozen woodcutters, who had slain a bear in the forest and smitten off his paw. I had joined the party and had a moment's leisure to examine them before the echo of Ethan's blast returned from the hill. Not one, but many echoes had caught up the harsh and tuneless sound, untwisted its complicated threads, and found 1,000 aerial harmonies in one stern trumpet tone. It was a distinct yet distant and dreamlike symphony of melodious instruments, as if an airy band had been hidden on the hillside and made faint music at the summons. No subsequent trial produced so clear, delicate, and spiritual a concert as the first. A field piece was then discharged from the top of a neighboring hill and gave birth to one long reverberation which ran round the circle of mountains in an unbroken chain of sound and rolled away without a separate echo. After these experiments, the cold atmosphere drove us all into the house with the keenest appetites for supper. It did one's heart good to see the great fires that were kindled in the parlor and bar-room, especially the latter, where the fireplace was built of rough stone and might have contained the trunk of an old tree for a backlog. A man keeps a comfortable hearth when his own forest is at his very door. In the parlor, when the evening was fairly set in, we held our hands before our eyes to shield them from the ruddy glow, and began a pleasant variety of conversation. The mineralogist and the physician talked about the invigorating qualities of the mountain air and its excellent effect on Ethan Crawford's father, an old man of 75, with a heartbroken frame of middle life. The two brides and the doctor's wife held a whispered discussion which, by their frequent titterings and a blush of two, seemed to have reference to the trials or enjoyments of the matrimonial state. The bridegrooms sat together in a corner, rigidly silent, like Quakers whom the Spirit moveth not, being still in the odd predicament of bashfulness towards their own young wives. The Green Mountain Squire chose me for his companion and described the difficulties he had met with half a century ago in traveling from the Connecticut River through the Notch to Conway, now a single day's journey, though it had cost him 18. The Georgians held the album between them and favored us with the few specimens of its contents, which they considered ridiculous enough to be worth hearing. One extract met with deserved applause. It was a sonnet to the snow on Mountain Washington, and had been contributed that very afternoon, bearing a signature of great distinction in magazines and annuals. The lines were elegant and full of fancy, but too remote from familiar sentiment, and cold as their subject, resembling those curious specimens of crystallized vapor which I observed next day on the mountaintop. The poet was understood to be the young gentleman of the gold opera-glasses who heard our laudatory remarks with the composure of a veteran. Such was our party, and such their ways of amusement, but on a winter evening another set of guests assembled at the hearth where these summer travelers were now sitting. I once had it in contemplation to spend a month hereabouts in sleighing time for the sake of study. The yeomen of New England who then elbow each other through the Notch by hundreds on their way to Portland. There could be no better school for such a place than Ethan Crawford's Inn. Let the student go thither in December, sit down with the teamsters at their meals, share their evening merriments, and repose with them at night when every bed has its 3 occupants and parlor, bar-room, and kitchen are strewn with slumberers around the fire. Then let him rise before daylight, button his greatcoat muffle up his ears, and stride with the departing caravan a mile or two to see sturdily they make head against the blast. To see how sturdily they make head against the blast. A treasure of characteristic traits will repay all inconveniences, even should a frozen nose be of the number. The conversation of our party soon became more animated and sincere, and we recounted some traditions of the Indians who believed that the father and mother of their race were saved from a deluge by ascending. I think that's a misprint. I did look it up. It should be descending or ascending. The peak of Mount Washington. The children of that pair have been overwhelmed and found no such refuge. In the mythology of the savage, these mountains were afterwards considered sacred and inaccessible, full of unearthly wonders, illuminated at lofty heights by the blaze of precious stones, and inhabited by deities, who sometimes shrouded themselves in snowstorms and came down on the lower world. There are few legends more poetical than that of the Great Carbuncle of the White Mountains. The belief, as communicated to the English settlers and is hardly yet extinct, that a gem of such immense size as to be seen shining miles away hangs from a rock over a clear, deep lake, high up among the hills. They who had once beheld its splendor were enthralled with an unutterable yearning to possess it. But a spirit guarded that inestimable jewel and bewildered the adventurer with a dark mist from the enchanted lake. Thus life was worn away in the vain search for an unearthly treasure, till at length the deluded one went up the mountain, still sanguine as in youth, but returned no more. On this theme, methinks I could frame a tale with a deep moral. The hearts of the pale faces would not thrill to these superstitions of the red men, though we spoke of them in the center of the haunted region. The habits and sentiments of that departed people were too distinct from those of their successors to find much real sympathy. It has often been a matter of regret to me that I was shut out from the most peculiar field of American fiction by an inability to see any romance or poetry or grandeur or beauty in the Indian character, at least till such traits were pointed out by others. I do abhor an Indian story, yet no writer can be more secure of a permanent place in our literature than the biographer of the Indian chiefs. His subject, as referring to tribes which have mostly vanished from the earth, gives him a right to be placed on a classic shelf, apart from the merits which will sustain him there. I made inquiries whether in this researches about these parts, our mineralogist had found the 3 silver hills, which an Indian sachem sold to an Englishman nearly 200 years ago, and the treasures of which the posterity of the purchaser I have been looking for ever since. But the man of science had ransacked every hill along the Saco and knew nothing of these prodigious piles of wealth. By this time, as usual with men, on the eve of great adventure, we had prolonged our session deep into the night, considering how early we were set out on our 6 miles' ride to the foot of Mount Washington. There was now a general breaking up. I scrutinized the faces of the 2 bridegrooms and saw but little probability of their leaving the bosom of earthly bliss in the first week of the honeymoon, and at the frosty hour of 3 to climb above the clouds, nor when I felt how sharp the wind was as it rushed through a broken pane and eddied between the chinks of my unplastered chamber, did I anticipate much electricity on my own part, though we were to seek for the Great Carbuncle.